Hello everyone. So now we are going to discuss about something which affects how we perceive things, how we make meaning out of things, which is cognition, and how our sensorial modalities work on what basis, and that is about the context of use. So, when we were talking about multisensorial modalities, we already spoke a little bit of the context of use. What if you are in a noisy environment and you cannot use the audio modality? So, build your product so that the visual modality and the haptics modality can take it forward. Now, we will see it in a much larger scale. The context of use also is about the cultural context in which meanings are created and meanings are situated into it. So that particular part we have already covered when we were talking about the cultural dimensions. So we will be talking about all those context of use which has not been spoken for in much detail till now. So, the key learning outcomes in this particular lecture are going to be, we will explain how physical environment, the social setting, and the user state, including context as situational impairment, shape a particular interaction. Then we will see how to choose and apply in situ research methods, which is like contextual inquiry, field study, stress testing, to capture these real conditions of use. Then we will look at design for multimodal adaptive interfaces that degrade gracefully when a sensory channel or input is disabled by context. So, what is context? Context includes physical environment, lighting, noise level, temperature, the social setting. So either you are alone or with others, with colleagues. So this others can mean different things. So it can be family members, it can be a little kid, it can be an elderly, or it can also be your colleagues or unknown people. Then comes the user state, whether your user is focused, is distracted, is tired, is in motion. Then the device, whether the context is about a phone, a tablet, a desktop, a watch. The network, whether it is high-speed Wi-Fi, it is a spotty 4G, or you are completely offline. And task constraints, like quick lookup versus deep learning. Context isn't a static thing. It changes moment to moment, and mobile design must account for these varied contexts. So crucially, context does not merely inconvenience your user, it temporarily removes certain abilities. So, for example, bright sun degrades the vision, a noisy environment degrades your hearing, walking degrades fine motor control. So, this is the principle of situational impairment. Every user goes through this at some point or the other point. So every user at some point or the other point is disabled because of the context in which they are. So the environmental factors which affect your design, so the context formed by these environmental factors. So one of them is about the lighting conditions, whether you are in bright sunlight where the readability of low contrast screens is difficult. So target contrast which is greater than equal to 4.5:1 with larger text. Dark settings need less contrast, otherwise it will hurt the eyes. So there has to be adaptive brightness, which should respond to the ambient light. Never rely on color alone, because we had already discussed about 8% of men have color vision deficiency. Then comes the noise level. So noisy environments like restaurants, streets, or gym, they make auditory feedback inaudible. Or like silent contexts like libraries and meetings make it an inappropriate choice. So pair every sound with a visual or haptic equivalent. Haptic feedback works in all lighting and all sorts of noise conditions. Mobility and stability. Walking users need a stable interface. So large touch targets, which are approximately greater than equal to 44:44 pixels, reduce precision demands. Minimal two-hand operation requirement, because hand tremor increases when you are in movement, and then at that point of time, if you are supposed to do two-hand operations, it reduces accuracy. Seated users can manage smaller targets, but mobile users find it difficult to do it. When I say mobile, it implies you are moving and not basically a mobile interface. Now coming to the network quality. High-speed Wi-Fi makes rich media feasible. Spotty 4G demands offline first design, compression and tolerance of intermittent connectivity. Provide a manual fallback for every connected feature so the design degrades gracefully. So now context as a situational impairment. So a user's environment can disable them as surely as a permanent condition. So there is this whole persona spectrum which is happening not just because the person has certain kind of disability, but also because situationally you are disabled because of the context in which you are operating a product. So I have three types of disability: permanent, temporary and situational. We already spoke about it. So temporary, let's say in terms of vision, so I might have permanent blindness. I might have permanent deafness or some kind of limb differences or tremors in my limbs. So around 1 billion people worldwide, they fall under this particular impairment. Impairment can be temporary. So let's say because I went through an eye surgery, so for the time being I have certain impairment in my eyes, or I had an ear infection and as a result temporarily I have certain impairment in my ears. The ability returns, but the design barrier is still identical as we had in case of permanent, because for that temporary time frame I still need that additional support. Now comes situational. So a condition created by context, like sun glare, again brings you to the same context. Vision impairment. A noisy platform brings in the auditory impairment. Holding a child or you have a divided attention, they bring in motor impairments or cognitive impairments. So it affects every user many times a day. So why this matters for our user research? Because the context of use in situational impairment, when you're designing for situational impairment, it helps you to cater for the requirements of temporary as well as permanent impairment. Now we will move from these particular environment caused impairments to the social context and the cognitive state and the impairments that can be caused because of that. So I might be alone or I might be in a social context. So alone, which means I can take some time and explore certain features while I am with others. So I might get self-conscious about screen content. So say for example, I'm using social media and certain kind of content comes which I become uncomfortable because I am in company of others. Or I am in a banking application and now my concern is my privacy, my financial data. And I might prefer quick tasks under that. It might be a work versus leisure context. So in a work context, I might be focused on that particular task. So there will be a low tolerances for distractions. So a notification coming in is a distraction and I will not like to have that because I'm focused on my task. Now leisure is something, let's say I am in an exploratory mode because right now I'm in leisure situation. I am feeling more playful when I'm trying to explore something. So see if you can use the same app differently depending on whether you are in a work versus a leisure context. Now coming to focused versus multitasking. So focused, whenever you have a very complex workflow or detail heavy context, like say in this particular lecture you are supposed to be focused because I'm teaching you a lot of details about a complex topic. So at that point of time a focused mode should be available. Whereas when I'm multitasking or you are expecting that somebody is supposed to do this particular activity while they are multitasking, so then it should be simple, it should be glanceable content rather than a detailed content. Now coming to interruptions. So real world users are interrupted frequently. So design must support resumption from the point where you got distracted or you got interrupted and you can come back. So there should be options for saving the state, showing the progress or enable pausing when the context disables a particular channel. So context, and it is not about the user, decides which sensory channel is available. So design for the one that survives. So as we already spoke about about my context of use, so I have bright sunlight and screen glare, so disable the visual. Make the auditory and the haptic do the rest of the activity. If I have a loud environment, then let the visual and the haptic take over. if I have a silent meeting or a library context, let the visual and the haptic do their job. Auditory is an exclamation mark because you have to consider whether it is required, for what kind of situation it is required. So say for example, if the meteorological department wants to send you a emergency alert and you are in a meeting room or a library, then definitely irrespective of the fact that you are in a silent environment, the product should be designed in a manner that it can override your silence preferences and offer to you the auditory feedback, because the emergency is more important than the silence of that environment. Now let's say your phone is inside your pocket or your eyes are somewhere else because of whatever reason. So in that case, again, the auditory and the haptic needs to be given preferences. Now let's say I am walking or otherwise in some kind of motion because I am in a moving train or a bus and so on. So again, the visual becomes difficult over there. The auditory is and the haptic are still available to you. As I told you, the emergency situation, it is something which I will call as it works, but it is socially intrusive, but it is essential in that particular context. So you design for that case. So always design for the worst case. The channel available in every context above is haptic. You must have noticed. So even for haptics to work, you have to also ensure that the product is in close contact with your body. Otherwise, this particular modality will not work. Then safety critical feedback should travel on at least 2 independent channels. If it is safety critical, it is always a good idea that you use as far as possible all the 3 channels so that people do not miss the information. Now let's try to understand this real world context. So in the laboratory testing, so I am doing a user research right now, what I will be missing is the real world context. So as we had earlier discussed in one of the weeks about contextual inquiry. So when we are conducting contextual inquiry, this is the whole logic. So I will be missing the real context. So we perform, rather than user test in the lab, we try to perform it on the field so that I do not miss onto this real world context. So users perform differently in a lab where they are more focused, conscious of being observed, than in their real use where they are distracted, they are also doing multitasking, and they are also interrupted. So contextual inquiry observes users in their actual environment. When you are doing ethnographic research, it also immerses the designers in users' real worlds. In the wild studies, deploy prototypes in real context. So together these methods surface context-driven problems like glare, noise, interruptions, weak signal that a lab cannot do. So that's where understanding what you are trying to understand from your user research is extremely important. If you are trying to understand how the product will actually perform in the real world, it is very important to select all those user research methods which does the research in the real world context and not in the lab. The lab is not the world. Behavior is in a control room like a lab. So even when I am doing contextual inquiry or ethnographic research, there is this feeling amongst the participants that there is someone who is observing. However, soon this observer slowly starts going into the background if the observer is able to achieve that through different methods that we have already discussed. However, in a lab environment, you can never achieve that. The behavior as a result is quite different. So say for example, I am trying to see whether people will be able to operate a ATM machine in the lab or not. Most likely they will be able to operate it with very few errors. Why? Because they are focused, there is no distraction. But you put the same context in the actual field where they also know that some actual money is going to come out and money is going to be deducted from their bank account, and they might have a child along with that. They might have also 5 people waiting in the queue behind them. Then the real world context kicks in, and the context influences people's rate of errors, people's anxiety, and how the interface can be actually designed so that all of these can be minimized. Then context shapes the behavior. So like physical environment, social setting and user state change how a product is used. So say for example, in the same ATM example that we were talking about, if there are 5 people waiting behind you and you are struggling with the interface and you start feeling bad that, okay, there are lots of people waiting behind me and I am not able to operate this machine properly. So that will start shaping your behavior. Now coming to ecological validity. So findings generalize only if the study context resembles the real condition of use. So you can also do the ATM's testing in the lab. However, if you want to do that, try to simulate as much as possible the real conditions. So maybe this is still a real ATM from which money will come out from your bank balance, and you still have 5 people who might be fellow researchers only who are waiting behind them. So in this simulated environment, you are still not having the exact situation, but you are trying to resemble as close as possible, and that will help you in building an ecological validity in case ATM as a product, it is a new product, not certified yet, so you cannot put it into the real environment and you still need to test it. So that is how I created this simulated environment for ecological validity. Now comes the hidden variables. Lighting, noise, interruptions and connectivity are all part of the user experience. So let's say a video call app that works on office Wi-Fi may stutter on a hotel network with a baby nearby. So if you are trying to understand the actual performance of a product, try to understand what these hidden variables might be. So is there an effect of the lighting condition? Is there an effect of the noise? The different kinds of interruptions possible and connectivity. So when you're designing your user research, try to also measure these possible hidden variables and try to create a correlation whether the number of errors was dependent on the lighting condition or not. Did the error rate increase when the noise in the environment increased, and so on. So that will also help you in understanding what environmental factors do you need to control for, or what environmental factors which are not controllable. So your design has to accommodate in a manner that you are able to counter the impact of the environmental context of use. Now coming to this context of use in practice when I am trying to do certain research in terms of research tactics. So research in situ. So use contextual inquiry and field studies to observe real conditions directly. So shadow a nurse during a shift to see how charting software fits between patient handoffs. Of course, when I say shadowing, it just means that you are following, but she already knows that you are following and you are making this record. So you should have proper permissions to do the activity. Then coming to sample context and not just users. So what it implies, you plan for different kinds of users. Oh, I want to recruit 5 users of type A, 5 users of type B, and so on. That's not just enough. You have to also sample for the context. So plan for varied environments. Like I will do 10 tests with type A kind of users when they are commuting, or I will do or when they are at home, and so on. So different context I bring in. Then coming to the capture the environment. So you can use photographs, you can do notes of the surroundings, and you can try to capture how many interruptions came in, what kind of interruptions came in, and whether there were other people also present. So for example, photograph of warehouse workers, scanner station to record lighting, gloves and shelf height. And then you will be able to analyze what was the impact of these different contextual factors on the performance of the user on a given task or a given product. Stress test context. So deliberately probe edge conditions. So low light, for example. So you know that maybe so much of low light is not possible, but you will stress test it, or people will not go into so much of glare condition and use your app, but still you are stress testing in order to ensure that your product functions. So you will look at very poor signals. You can also look at very divided attention. So always think if it is useful for your user research to have this one session on stress test context. So you run a mobile checkout flow on 3G with screen at 50% brightness and one hand occupied. Now coming to graceful degradation. So every primary input fails in some context. The design must already have a fallback. So let's say when I am having some gestural fails. So let's say my hands are wet, or there are gloves on my hands, or there is a sensor occlusion happening. So fallback should always be there. So there should be a visible button or tap target somewhere. Never gesture only. So do not make gesture only. Then comes to voice fails. So let's say there is a lot of background noise, or there are lots of accents. Different people have different kinds of accents, or there is an overlapping speech. So you have to build a recovery ladder. So give a re-prompt, offer options, or fall back to screen or manual control. Then we can have connectivity and sensor fails. So no signal or dead battery, sun on a camera. Again, have some fallback. So let's say if I'm expecting that there is going to be no signal possibility and still the app should be useful, then I might think of some offline first design as well. So say for example, I have these apps like M-Aadhaar app and DigiYatra apps which need to work. Because I'm carrying my tickets onto it, my boarding passes onto it, and I am also having my ID card on M-Aadhaar app. Now, I might be in a situation where I don't have network, but I still need my ID card to work for me, and otherwise people will switch back to physical ID cards only. So in that case, for these kind of apps, I need to have a offline first design. So I need to ensure that whether there is network or no network or slow network, the application will work. Then coming to manual override. So let's say the battery is almost about to die. I should have an option for, and the phone goes into save battery mode. Then I should have an option to undo that, because I know that I am almost about to reach to a charger, or I really need that background refresh to keep happening because it is critical for my activities. So I should have a manual override. And stress test tolerances should be done. So in the field, deliberately test the failure path, cut the network, add noise, simulate gloves. A design that works only in the ideal condition has not truly been evaluated. Now, when I'm trying to evaluate this context of use, you know that lab usability tests strip away context. So these methods bring real conditions into the evidence. So I did contextual inquiry in order to get the real context, and I do on-site, so in situ testing also. So here I will observe and interview users in their real environment, capturing light, noise, interruption, and bystanders, which a lab might remove. However, if when you are trying to design your user research framework, what all you will note, if you did not put that I want to note down the lighting, the noise and other things, you will again, although you conducted the user research on field, you will still be like it is equivalent to conducting in lab because you did not note them down. So it is lost information. Then always try to see that first use field observation if it can be captured. So watch a new user attempting to do the core task that you are supposed to do using the product that you have designed, and make them do it without any aid, and as I would call in the wild, which implies that in real condition with all interruptions, whether it be social interruptions or environmental interruptions happen, which will expose the major challenges, the gaps that the lab briefing always hide. Then also design for stress testing the context. So probe edge conditions on purpose. So let's say there is low light, weak signal, and there is a method called the halt reliability testing. So the halt reliability testing tells you exactly for a particular category what are these edge cases that you can try to test your product for in order to understand that your product will, the likelihood of its failure is lower. Then comes to accessibility and assistive tech audit. So test with screen readers, magnifiers, switch access, automated audits can also be done. However, they will be able to capture about 30 to 40% of the issues. So first you run an automated audit, then you do a revision of your design, and then always go ahead for actual user testing in order to identify all the problems. Always remember, context is everything. Brilliant design that ignores context fails. Contextual design is the foundation of user research. So the key takeaways from this lecture is context gives you a situational impairment. And it can be about the environmental, it can be about the social, or it can be about the network and so on. So design for considering all of them. So in each one of these situations, you will have a certain kind of impairment: visual impairment, auditory impairment, or impairment of your cognitive system itself. So design for all the channels which are available in order to cater to this requirement of situational impairment. Always remember, lab is not equal to the world. Try to test in the real world. In case it is not feasible in the lab itself, try to simulate as much as possible the real world. And when I say that, it implies all the context: the environmental context, the social context, the cognitive context, and so on. Always design for graceful degradation, and that should be your key motto. So graceful degradation implies that if a particular modality fails, then another modality, the fallback, should kick in very nicely, so that people do not fail using the product. People don't get frustrated with the product. So here are some of the key references that you can go through, and that brings us to the end of week 6. See you in the next week.